All right, let's get right into this explainer and deconstruct the incredibly fascinating, seriously dark, and famously contradictory mind of Fyodor Dostoyevsky's narrator from Notes from the Underground. We're talking about a text that essentially birthed the modern anti-hero. It's written from the perspective of a hyper-intelligent, deeply isolated former civil servant living in this wretched little room in 19th century St. Petersburg. He spent 40 years just obsessively observing the world, and let me tell you, he has a lot to say about human nature, reason, and free will. So get ready to step into a mind that's as compelling as it is uncomfortable, and we'll see exactly why his insights hit so close to home even today.
Talk about starting in the deep end, right? This famous admission instantly hooks us into the psyche of a radically unreliable narrator, a guy who literally uses spite as his primary coping mechanism. Right off the bat, he tells us he thinks his liver is diseased. But does he go to a doctor? Nope, absolutely refuses. And he knows he's a well-educated man, he completely respects medicine, and he is perfectly aware that by not getting help, he's only hurting himself. No one else cares. Yet his attitude is basically, my liver is bad? Well, let it get worse. This perfectly establishes spite as his ultimate weapon when he feels powerless. If the world isn't going to bend to his will, he's going to stubbornly break himself just to prove he has the agency to do it.
Now, this underground he talks about, it's not just some physical basement on the outskirts of town. It's a completely self-destructive mental habitat fueled by extreme isolation. It's a state of being. You see, after he inherited a little bit of money, he immediately quit his government job and just retreated into his corner. He purposefully cuts himself off from society, and he actually finds this sick, twisted sweetness in his own degradation. In that isolation, every minor slight, every embarrassing memory just ferments. He tells us he has these hysterical impulses, and his only outlet is reading and retreating even further into his own head. Honestly, it's a lot like how people today can fall into these massive, isolated online echo chambers, cutting themselves off from real society while their resentments just boil over in pure digital isolation.
Get this, he actually diagnoses his own massive intellect and acute awareness as a literal, paralyzing sickness. He argues that for a normal person's everyday needs, having even half or a quarter of his level of consciousness would be more than enough. The problem, he says, is that every time he tries to find a primary cause for an action, it instantly draws him into this infinite, agonizing regression of deeper and deeper causes. Say he gets insulted and wants revenge. Well, his anger undergoes this sort of chemical disintegration. By the time he thinks it through, the object of his anger evaporates, the reasons vanish, and he's left with absolutely nothing to strike at. Sound familiar? It's incredibly similar to modern doom scrolling or information overload, where having access to way too much data leaves us utterly paralyzed and unable to take any meaningful action. To make sense of this paralysis, he breaks humanity down into two distinct camps. On one side, you have the normal man of action, who he thinks is stupid, sure, but highly capable of actually doing things. On the other side, you have himself, the paralyzed, overthinking mouse, retreating into its hole. When the normal man of action hits an impossible barrier, what he calls a stone wall, like the laws of physics or math, he just accepts it. The wall is actually soothing to him. But the hyperconscious mouse? No way. He refuses to just reconcile with the wall simply because he lacks the strength to knock it down. So instead of acting, the mouse just creates a stinking, toxic mess of doubts around the original insult and eventually creeps back into his little mouse hole, totally consumed by cold, everlasting spite.
And all of this deep, agonizing insecurity, it bleeds directly into the very structure of his diary. It becomes a safe haven filled with contradictions for a man absolutely terrified of real social interaction. He explicitly tells us, I'm only writing for myself to get rid of an oppressive memory, kind of like a song stuck in your head. But then he spends half the text directly addressing an imaginary audience of gentlemen. He's constantly anticipating their mockery. Oh, you laugh? You think I'm mad? He even admits he invents their criticisms just to listen to them through a crack under the floorboards. It's a brilliant psychological defense. By preemptively mocking his own ideas, he protects his incredibly fragile ego from any actual judgment. It's basically the 19th century equivalent of posting a deeply personal confession anonymously online, but wrapping it in 10 layers of irony just to deflect the haters.
So this brings us to the core of his violent philosophical rebellion against that stone wall of rationalism and scientific deduction. Back in the mid-19th century, thinkers were starting to suggest that eventually all human behavior could be entirely explained by science. That if we just crack the code, every human action could be tabulated mathematically, like a logarithm table. The underground man finds this profoundly horrifying, because if everything is mathematically predetermined, what happens to human free will?
His sheer horror at being reduced to a math equation is exactly the same creeping dread we feel today when opaque digital algorithms try to predict, categorize, and dictate every single choice we make online. To him, the fact that twice 2 makes 4 is just an insult, some arrogant bouncer standing with his arms crossed, blocking your path. He calls this terrifying, perfectly mathematically optimized future the Palace of Crystal. In this utopian vision, science and logic completely re-educate human nature. All economic relations are mathematically exact, every possible question just vanishes because every possible answer is already provided, there are no more adventures, no more surprises. It's this grand, indestructible building where you aren't even allowed to stick your tongue out on the sly. The Palace of Crystal is essentially the ultimate tech utopian dream of our modern era, right? A totally frictionless, perfectly optimized world curated by big data.
But here is where he throws a massive wrench into the gears. He asks a wildly provocative question. What if humanity fundamentally despises this perfection and actually craves chaos instead? The Underground Man argues that people are just phenomenally ungrateful. If you were to drown a man in a literal sea of happiness, give him so much economic prosperity that he had nothing to do but sleep and eat cake, out of sheer spite, he would play a nasty trick on you just to break the monotony. He warns that it's actually boredom in this Palace of Crystal that would lead people to do terrible things, like historical figures sticking golden pins into people just for a thrill. He admits humans love to build things, like ants building an anthill, but maybe, just maybe, we are instinctively terrified of actually finishing the project. He answers his own question by saying humans will intentionally act against their own best interests and even embrace suffering just to prove they have independent choice, to prove they aren't just little piano keys being played by the universe, or in modern terms, just to prove they aren't predictable data points in an algorithm. This, he says, is the most advantageous advantage that philosophers always forget to include in their spreadsheets: independent choice, no matter how much it costs you. Even if you mathematically prove to a man that he was just a piano key, he would purposefully go insane, create total destruction, and just cause chaos purely to prove you wrong. Suffering, he argues, is the entire origin of consciousness, and he is never giving that up for some mathematically perfect anthill.
Okay, but let's bring all this lofty, grand philosophy crashing right back down to his pathetic reality. When we shift into the second part of his diary, looking back at his 20s, his grand defense of human freedom starts looking a whole lot less heroic. He describes his youth as solitary and gloomy. He constantly felt like everyone at his office looked at him with absolute loathing, while simultaneously possessing this totally unbounded vanity. He'd swing wildly from despising his coworkers to thinking they were basically gods. And to escape this crushing social anxiety, he engaged in what he calls petty, dark, underground vice, sneaking out into the night, absolutely terrified of being recognized. Honestly, it's virtually impossible not to see the exact psychological profile of the modern internet troll here. Someone deeply isolated, feeling both inferior and superior, sneaking out into the anonymous dark to lash out and grab a fleeting sense of power. If you want to see exactly how ridiculous this gets, just look at his grand revenge plot. He spends months agonizing over how to bump shoulders with this 6-foot officer who once picked him up by the shoulders and moved him out of the way like a fly in a tavern. Didn't even say a word, just moved him. That humiliation gnawed at our guy for years. He starts stalking the officer on the street, and to enact his revenge, which literally just consists of refusing to step out of the way on the sidewalk, he decides he has to look like a social equal. So he borrows a massive amount of money from his superior just to buy this fancy German beaver collar for his coat. He loses sleep, he runs actual fevers, entirely obsessed with staging this deeply awkward, completely one-sided pedestrian collision. And when the moment finally happens, he literally closes his eyes and they just ram shoulder to shoulder. The officer is way bigger, so he barely even registers it and just steps right past him. But the Underground Man? He goes home feeling absolutely triumphant. He is literally singing Italian arias in his room, totally convinced he successfully defended his dignity. It is hilarious, but it is also a stunningly tragic portrait of how his hyperconsciousness traps him. Here is a guy who can construct the most brilliant philosophical takedown of utopian rationalism, yet his absolute greatest real-world achievement is aggressively bumping into a stranger on the sidewalk and believing he's conquered the universe. So we're left with this massive, enduring, and honestly pretty uncomfortable question about human nature. It asks you to look inward at your own rebellion against just being another statistic. Look, Dostoevsky's Underground Man is repulsive, he's spiteful, and yeah, he's incredibly pathetic.
But he also strikes a terrifyingly recognizable chord in all of us. When society tells you exactly what you're supposed to do, when pure logic, or an algorithm, dictates your perfect next move, is there a little part of you that just wants to smash it all to pieces to prove you're still at the steering wheel? It's a question that makes this 19th century diary feel as urgent today as it did the moment it was written. Think about that, the next time you decide to purposefully ignore some really good advice.